The wind came down off the Bitterroot Range like something with teeth, and Sarah Voss pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stood at the crossroads outside Miller's Gap, wondering if she would freeze to death before nightfall or simply starve first. It had been 3 days since her last real meal, a heel of bread she'd split with her daughter, Ellie, who was 6 years old and had stopped complaining about her hunger sometime around the second day, which frightened Sarah more than any amount of crying could have. Children who stopped complaining were children who had learned that complaining did no good, and no mother wanted her child to learn that lesson so young. Her husband, Thomas, had been dead 8 months now, thrown from a horse while breaking a new mare for a rancher 2 counties over, and in that time Sarah had sold everything she owned that could be sold. The good china her mother had given her, the wedding quilt, even Thomas's pocket watch, which had nearly broken her heart worse than his funeral had. She had tried taking in laundry. She had tried mending clothes for the women in town who could afford to pay someone else to mend theirs. But Miller's Gap was a small town with more widows than it had worked for, and eventually the money ran out the way money always did, quietly and then all at once, like a candle guttering. She was walking toward Cheyenne, though she had no clear notion of what waited for her there, when the wagon rolled up beside her and a man she did not recognize reined in his team. He was perhaps 35, with a weathered face that had seen more sun than shade, dark hair going gray at the temples, and eyes the color of creek water in autumn, gray-green and steady. He wore a canvas coat, patched at one elbow, and he looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he is trying to solve, rather than the way most men looked at a woman alone on the road, which was usually with either pity or something worse. "You're a long way from anywhere, ma'am," he said. "We're headed to Cheyenne," Sarah said, and she was aware of how her voice cracked on the word, aware of how Ellie's small hand tightened in hers. "Cheyenne's 200 miles if it's an inch, and there's snow coming down from the mountains inside a week. You won't make it walking." He looked at Ellie, who peered up at him from behind her mother's skirts, and something in his hard face softened, just slightly, like a crust of ice giving way to the water beneath. "Can you cook?" The question was so unexpected that Sarah nearly laughed, though there was no laughter left in her, only a kind of hollow astonishment. "I beg your pardon? Can you cook?" he repeated, as though it were the most reasonable question in the world to ask a starving stranger on a dirt road. "I've got a ranch 6 miles west of here. 400 head of cattle, 3 hired hands, and not one of us can make a meal that doesn't taste like it was cooked out of spite. My housekeeper left a month back to marry a man in Laramie, and I have been eating burned beans and worse ever since. I need someone who can cook, keep a house, and I have a spare room in the loft that's dry and warm enough for a child. Room, board, and $8 a month. I'm not asking anything else of you, if that's what's worrying that look on your face." Sarah studied him for a long moment, and he let her, standing there in the cold with his hand still loose on the reins, patient as a man waiting out weather. She had heard stories, of course. Every widow had heard stories, of men who made such offers and meant something else entirely by them. But there was nothing in his eyes but the plain tiredness of a man who had been eating burned beans for a month and missed having a warm meal and a clean house. "My name is Sarah Voss," she said. "This is my daughter, Ellie." "John Bishop," he said, and he climbed down from the wagon seat to help them up. And that was how Sarah Voss came to the Bishop Ranch, with nothing to her name but a daughter, a threadbare shawl, and a question that would come to feel, in time, like the hinge on which her whole life had turned. The ranch house was a low, sturdy building of hewn logs, larger than Sarah had expected, with a great stone hearth and a kitchen that had clearly not been properly cleaned in some time. The 3 hired hands, a lanky young man named Pete, an older cowboy called Dutch who had a silver mustache and a limp, and a quiet Mexican vaquero named Rafael who tended the horses, looked at her with open curiosity when John brought her in, but none of them said anything unkind, and by the second day they had all 3 declared, with great solemnity, that Sarah's biscuits were the finest thing that had ever passed their lips, which was likely true given what they'd been surviving on before. Sarah threw herself into the work the way a drowning woman throws herself at anything that floats. She scrubbed the kitchen from ceiling to floor. She found the root cellar half full of forgotten potatoes and onions and turned them into stews that filled the house with a smell so rich that Dutch claimed he cried the first time he smelled it, though he blamed it on the smoke from the hearth when Pete teased him for it. She baked bread twice a week, and pies when the dried apples in the pantry allowed for it, and she kept the house clean and warm, and in the evenings, after Ellie had fallen asleep in the loft, she sat by the fire and mended shirts and darned socks and felt, for the first time in 8 months, something that was not quite happiness but was at least the shape happiness might take, seen from a great distance. John Bishop was not a talkative man. He ate his meals with the quiet appreciation of someone who had genuinely suffered without good cooking, and he thanked her every single time, without fail, in the same plain words. "That was a fine meal, Mrs. Voss," as though he were afraid that if he stopped saying it she might stop believing he meant it. He worked from before dawn until well after dark, riding the fence lines, doctoring sick cattle, hauling feed through the first snows that came down off the mountains just as he had predicted. He was not warm, exactly, not in those early weeks. But he was kind in the way that mattered most to Sarah, which was consistently, without asking for anything in return, and he was gentle with Ellie in a manner that surprised her, crouching down to her height when he spoke to her, letting her ride on the saddle in front of him when he checked the near pastures, carving her a small wooden horse out of a scrap of pine one evening while Sarah cooked, presenting it to her with the same gravity he might have used a hand over a legal document. "You didn't have to do that," Sarah told him later, once Ellie had gone to bed clutching the little horse to her chest. "I know," John said. He was sitting at the kitchen table, and the firelight caught the gray in his hair, made him look older and younger at once. "I wanted to." Autumn deepened into the first hard freezes, and the work of the ranch consumed everyone's days. Sarah learned the rhythms of it. The way the hands came in half-frozen and needed something hot before they could even speak, the way John's jaw tightened when a cow was lost to the cold or a wolf, the way the whole house seemed to hold its breath during the worst of the storms, waiting to see what the weather would take from them. She learned to make coffee strong enough to wake the dead, learned to keep a pot of stew simmering through the long nights so there was always something warm for a man coming in off a hard shift, learned the particular silence that fell over the kitchen table when everyone was too tired to talk but too grateful for the food to leave. It was in November that the trouble came. A neighboring rancher named Garrett Cole, a hard, ambitious man who had been trying for years to buy out Bishop's water rights, rode over with 2 of his men under the pretense of discussing a boundary dispute, though everyone at the table that evening understood it for what it was, an attempt to pressure John into selling off the northern acreage that held the best of his water. Sarah served the men coffee and biscuits, as hospitality demanded, and stood near the stove listening to Cole's honeyed threats disguised as neighborly concern, watching John's face go still and careful the way a man's face goes still when he is holding his temper by main force. "You do well to think on it, Bishop," Cole said, rising from the table at last, his eyes sliding over to Sarah with an appraising look that made her skin crawl. "Man in your position, widower, ranch running on thin help, could use a partner. Or a buyer, if it comes to that." His gaze lingered on Sarah a moment too long. "Fine cook you've got here. Didn't picture you the domestic sort." "She's not for sale any more than my land is, Cole," John said, and his voice was quiet, but there was something underneath it that made even Cole's men shift uncomfortably in their chairs. "I'll thank you to remember that when you're at my table." Cole laughed it off and made his goodbyes, but after his wagon had rattled off into the dusk, John stood at the window for a long time, watching the empty road, and Sarah found herself standing beside him without quite deciding to. "He'll be back," John said. "Men like Cole don't give up on water rights. Not ever." "You didn't have to speak up for me like that," Sarah said. John turned to look at her, and in the low lamplight his eyes had a depth to them she hadn't noticed before, or perhaps hadn't let herself notice. "Mrs. Voss, I don't say things I don't mean. Not to Cole, and not to you." He seemed about to say something further, then stopped himself, and instead simply added, "Get some sleep. Long day tomorrow." But something had shifted between them, some quiet unspoken thing, and Sarah lay awake that night in her small room off the kitchen, listening to Ellie's soft breathing from the trundle bed beside her own, and thought about the particular way John Bishop had said she's not for sale any more than my land is, and did not know what to make of the warmth that spread through her chest at the memory. The weeks that followed brought the first real snows, and with them a kind of forced closeness that came from everyone being confined more to the house. Sarah taught Ellie her letters by the fire while John went over the ranch accounts at the same table, and more than once she caught him watching the two of them instead of his ledger. A small, unguarded expression on his face that vanished the moment he realized he'd been seen. Dutch took to telling Ellie long, improbable stories about his younger days, most of which Sarah suspected were only half true, and Pete taught her to whistle badly, and Raphael brought her a barn cat's kitten one bitter evening, wrapped in his coat, because he said no child should go through winter without something small and warm to love. It was Christmas Eve when everything changed, though not in the dramatic way such changes happen in stories told by firesides. There was no sudden declaration, no swelling of music. There was only a quiet evening, the house smelling of the goose Sarah had roasted with the last of the dried cranberries she'd found in the pantry, and Ellie asleep at last after the excitement of the day, and John Bishop sitting across from Sarah at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee between them, neither of them quite ready for the evening to end. "I want to tell you something," John said, and his voice had none of its usual steadiness. "When I stopped my wagon on that road back in October, I told myself I was only doing a Christian kindness for a woman and a child who'd freeze otherwise. That's what I told myself, and it was true enough as far as it went." He turned his coffee cup slowly on the table, not looking at her. "But it wasn't the whole truth, and I think you deserve the whole truth, Sarah, if you'll let me use your name." "You may," she said, and her heart was beating very fast. "The whole truth is that I looked at you standing there in the cold, half-starved, still holding your daughter's hand like you'd have carried the whole world on your back before you'd let anything hurt her, and I thought I had never in my life seen anyone so strong. I lost my wife 4 years back, to a fever, and I told myself after that I was done wanting things I couldn't keep. But you've been in this house 3 months now, Sarah, and I find I don't know how to imagine it without you in it. I'm not a man who's good with pretty words. I've got a ranch and hard winters, and a temper I have to watch, and I know I'm asking a great deal. But I love you, plainly and completely, and I love that girl of yours like she was my own, and I'd be honored, more than honored, if you'd think about being my wife, and not just my cook." Sarah sat very still, and for a moment she could not speak at all, because the whole of the last 8 months rose up in her at once. The fear on that road, the hollow ache of Ellie's hunger, the terrible loneliness of grief carried alone, and set itself against this. A warm kitchen, a man's steady eyes across a table, a child sleeping safe and fed in the next room, a kitten curled by the fire, and a love that had crept up so quietly she had not noticed it arriving until it was already fully grown. "I came to you starving," she said at last, her voice thick. "I came to you with nothing, John. I didn't come looking for this." "I know," he said. "That's not a reason to say no." "It's not why I'm saying yes either," Sarah said, and she reached across the table and took his hand, felt the roughness of his palm, the calluses of a hard life honestly lived. "I'm saying yes because somewhere between October and now, this stopped being your house that I was keeping, and became a home I couldn't imagine leaving. Because you carved my daughter a wooden horse and taught her to sit a saddle and never once, not once, made either of us feel like a burden. Because I have loved you, I think, since the night you stood up to Garrett Cole and told him I wasn't for sale, and I have been too frightened of my own grief to say so." John Bishop, who was not a man given to displays of emotion, closed his eyes for a moment as though absorbing a blow, and when he opened them again there was something bright and unguarded in them that Sarah would remember for the rest of her life. He came around the table and knelt beside her chair, an old-fashioned gesture that suited his old-fashioned heart, and asked her properly, and she said yes properly, and when Ellie wandered out sleepily some time later, roused perhaps by the low murmur of voices, and found her mother in John Bishop's arms by the dying fire, she only smiled the particular smile of a child who has understood something true before the adults around her have finished saying it aloud, and climbed into both their laps at once, declaring with 6-year-old certainty that she had known it would happen weeks ago. They were married in January, in a small ceremony in Miller's Gap, with Dutch standing as witness and weeping unashamedly through the whole of it, blaming the cold for the wetness on his face just as he had blamed the smoke months before. Garrett Cole did come back, more than once, with his offers and his threats, but he found a ranch that stood united against him now in a way it hadn't before, A rancher with a wife at his side and a fierce, protective love for his family that no offer of money could touch. And eventually Cole's ambitions turned to easier prey elsewhere. By the time the snows melted and the first green came back to the high pastures, the Bishop Ranch had become known throughout the valley not merely for its cattle but for its table, for the woman who had once stood starving at a crossroads and now fed every hungry traveler, every lost cowhand, every neighbor in need who happened by, with a generosity born of having once known exactly what it meant to have nothing. Sarah Bishop, as she was known now, kept a kitchen that was the true heart of that ranch, warm and full and endlessly welcoming, and John would often stop in the doorway at the end of a long day's work just to watch her at the stove with Ellie helping at her side, and think that of all the questions he had ever asked in his life, the simplest one, "Can you cook?" had turned out to be the one that saved him. Years later, when Ellie was grown and had children of her own who begged for the story, Sarah would tell it to them by the same hearth, worn smooth now by decades of boots and firelight, and she would always end it the same way. She would tell them that she had come to that ranch starving for bread, and had found, instead, that she was starving for something else entirely. A home, a purpose, a love patient enough to wait for her grief to loosen its grip, and that John Bishop, gruff and quiet and steady as the mountains behind his land, had fed her all of it, slowly, faithfully, one winter at a time, until there was nothing hollow left in her at all, only a heart so full it overflowed into everyone who sat at her table. And every single time she told it, she would glance across the room at John, gray-haired now and slower in his step, but with the same creek-water eyes. And he would look back at her the exact way he had looked at her that first cold morning on the road, as though she were still the answer to a question he had not even known he'd been asking his whole life long.